Achievement it was to write Puget Sound Whales for Sale. It's the document. It's the only real history assembled in one place that there is. And I know it took a lot of arduous research, and you can ask her husband Dick about that. I'm pretty sure that there were a lot of long nights and a lot of expletives about some of the characters that she has to describe in the book. But it's a great book, a great read, and it's a complete history, including how the captures were stopped and the people involved in that. So it's not all just about, one capture after another. It's people coming together like right here and making it end. So with that, Sandra, please come on up.
Thanks very much, Howard. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the book and the capture era, which took place between 1965 and 1976. The captures actually started with the southern residents up in Canada in 1964 when Moby Doll was caught off Saturna Island. He was harpooned, and he was the first southern resident captured. And he was harpooned for the the plan was that a sculptor was commissioned, and he was the person who went out to harpoon the whales. And the idea was that they would use the body to mold or to make a sculpture for the Vancouver Aquarium. So that was the first southern resident captured, although they didn't know at that particular time the difference between residents and transients. Move forward to 1965, enter Ted Griffin and Donald Goldsberry. Ted Griffin opened the Seattle Marine Aquarium down at Pier 56 in 1962, and he went after a whale called Namu up in British Columbia, which had been caught up in fishermen's nets. He wanted it for the aquarium, and he managed to get it for $8,000. Brought it back down to Seattle under the Deception Pass Bridge to a great deal of pomp and ceremony on arrival in Seattle. However, he wasn't satisfied with that. He decided he'd like a companion for Namu. So he and Goldsberry went out, and in those days they would use a helicopter and a harpoon gun from the helicopter as well as boats. And they spotted a number of whales in a pod and hunted them for about a couple of days. And eventually they harpooned a female, and they took the calf. The female died, and the calf that they took was the second southern resident captured, Shamu, SeaWorld's original Shamu, who was eventually leased to SeaWorld in 1965 after Griffin discovered that she didn't really get on with Namu. Namu was a northern resident, Shamu was a southern resident, and she was quite aggressive. So he was fortunate that SeaWorld was just opening their first park, and they were looking for killer whales. So that is where Shamu went. She was leased initially and then sold for $75,000. She died in 1971, and she had a history just prior to her death of an attack on a girl at SeaWorld. But then they weren't satisfied. They got the bit between their teeth. There was money in these whales, and they continued to capture them up until the big capture here in 1970 in Penn, Cove, which is, as you realize, one of the most notorious captures that there was. They drove the whole of the southern resident community of J, K and L pods, over 100 whales at that particular time, into Penn Cove here. They used seal bombs, which are explosives now illegal in the United States, to disorient them, and boats to ram them up. And the whales tried to split into two groups. Some went east, and the mothers and the calves went towards Deception Pass Bridge to try and escape, but they were not lucky enough. The boats were too fast for them, and they drove them into Penn Cove. So they kept these whales here for a couple of weeks, and they had around 15 corralled in one place and about 10 in another. And these whales, as Howard will no doubt have told you, they stay together for life. There is no dispersal. So they stay in their family groups, and the youngsters were the ones that the captors wanted. They were smaller, easier to train and easier to transport. And there were at least 12 whales between the ages of 2 and 5 at that particular time. We know that because of photos that were later looked at by Mike Bigg up in Canada, the researcher who started the photo identification studies of. There were 7 whales captured here, taken in Penn Cove. And I'll just tell you where they went. Lil Nuka went to see Arama Marineland, Galveston in Texas. Chappie and Jumbo went to Kamagura, SeaWorld, Japan. Clovis went to Marineland, Antibes, France. Ramu 3, later renamed Winston, went to Windsor Safari Park in England, and then later to SeaWorld San Diego. Ramu 4 went to Marineland of Australia, and Lolita, of course, went to the Miami Aquarium. There was also one other little whale, and she was called Whale, also known as Wally, and she stranded. She probably got separated from the pod in the hunt, and she ended up at the Munich Aquarium in Germany, and like so many of them, she only lasted a year. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the book about this 1970 Penn Cove capture, which of course also 4 calves and a female died at that particular time, and they tried to hide evidence of those carcasses. So this is Lolita, the last whale who was taken from here in Penn Cove. The last helpless victim to be taken away to a new life far removed from her family was Lolita, also known as Tokite, the only surviving southern resident still alive in captivity. Pixie Mailer, a resident of Oak Harbor, recounted, "There was a bunch of us who went down every day, and it's the worst thing that I've ever seen in my life. It should never have happened. The whales cried. We watched them load them and saw them specifically load a small one in the back of a truck. I think it was probably Lolita, and she cried and cried and cried the whole time. It's a sound you don't forget. You just don't. I'll never forget it." And I recently picked up a bit of information which I'll just read this little short piece here. When she went to this aquarium, the trainer at that time was the late Pat Sykes, and she also later helped with the campaign to have Lolita listed as endangered. And she described Lolita's arrival at this aquarium. Lolita, had a very hard time. She just barely floated. The skin on her back cracked and bled from the sun and wind exposure. She wouldn't eat the diet of frozen herring. At night, she cried. So, following the uproar of this particular capture, Washington State in January 1971 brought in legislation requiring permits to capture killer whales. And the captors would have to pay $1,000 per whale. So on the 20th of August 1971, Griffin and Goldsberry got a permit to capture 6 killer whales. On the 21st of August 1971, they were back here in Penn Cove. They captured 3 whales, and they took another whale that they freeze branded and released that whale. So the 3 whales they captured then, I think I've got a note of that here. Those were Kona, Kandu 2, and Kandu 3. Kona and Kandu 3 went to SeaWorld San Diego, Kandu 2 to Germany. They still had a couple of opportunities to capture whales. In November, they were able to capture 2 more whales because the 3 that they had taken in Penn Cove covered under were covered under the permit, but because they had freeze branded and released the other whale, that was not considered a whale under the permit. So they captured 2 more in November of that year, and those 2 died. And then the following year, in March, the permit was almost due to expire, and they captured 1 more whale. So Don McGaffin was a reporter at that time, and I'm going to read a piece from the book here, which is his report of that Penn Cove capture in 1971. I just hope I can find where I marked it. I know I did. Okay. Like several other Seattle television people in the early 70s, keen to get a taste of island life, McGaffin scraped together enough money to buy a place on Whidbey Island. While taking a few days vacation to clean up the former newspaper offices he had sunk his cash into, he spotted the unmistakable sight of shining black and white orcas diving and surfacing in Penn Cove. They exploded right in front of me, McGaffin wrote, leaping, breaches, rolling, huffing, water slapping. Huge fins. It was magnificent, stunning, and solemn. As he watched the impressive parade breaking through the azure water, McGaffin gave little thought to the seaplanes circling high overhead. He was too intent on calling King 5 News Office to ask them to send a reporter and cameraman over to film the magnificent spectacle. But it was vacation time. Somebody might be there tomorrow, maybe the following day, no promises. The next morning, King 5 cameraman Bill Dorsey arrived on McGaffin's doorstep. There was no sign of a reporter. Resigned to losing his vacation time if the story was to be covered, McGaffin set off with Dorsey to find Frank Hennings, the Coupeville harbour master. He needed someone with a boat to ferry him and Dorsey out to photograph such a newsworthy event. 12 months after the notorious Penn Cove capture, whales had once again been herded into Penn Cove and were trapped in the nets. Loading their bulky camera equipment into Hennings's small black motorboat, the trio puttered deeper towards a U-shaped floating pier. Hundreds of feet of lines, topped with corks, swung from 3 sides. Mesh nets dangled from the 4th side. Occasionally, a glistening dorsal fin, reflecting the sunlight, surfaced behind the lines. Hennings manoeuvred the boat alongside the undulating pier, watched closely by 2 wetsuited divers, hands resting on hips. "Ahoy there, gentlemen," McGaffin spoke first. "We're from King 5 News. Okay if we come aboard?" The divers turned away. All right, come aboard." A stocky, barrel-chested man kneeling nearby mumbled irritably, "But stay out of the damn way." It was Donald Goldsberry. Dorsey set to work. He filmed the whales in the pen from every angle, standing, kneeling, and squatting on the wooden float. "Jesus, they're big," he murmured as they twisted, dived, and turned in search of an escape route. Suddenly, an eerie noise split the tranquility of the cove. "I can't describe it," McGaffin wrote. "The breathy whine, the cry, the long, weeping, keening cry." Then, we were surrounded by another weird, wonderful sound. The killers outside the nets were calling to the orca trapped in the nets. But there was a human note in that cry, a sobbing mule. McGaffin shivered, listening to the plaintive, heart-rending cries. The capture team, indifferent to the film crew and the animals' plight, carried on with their work. So that was the 1971 capture. And then in 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act came in, which afforded a little more protection, but they could still apply for permits. Griffin pulled out in 1972 when the Marine Mammal Protection Act came in. I understand he went to Eastern Washington. So Goldsberry was left to carry on alone, and he joined up with SeaWorld. Now, they then were working on a new marine park, and they requested a letter of exemption so that they did not lose, they didn't have to lay off staff, but they wanted a permit for killer whales. And they got that letter of exemption, of hardship exemption. And they then applied for a permit to capture killer whales. and they got one to capture 4 killer whales in March, I think it was March 1973. And that permit was quite a long time before it expired. And the last known capture of the southern residents was up in Canada in August 73, nothing to do with Griffin and Goldsberry on this particular occasion. In 1976, this was the end of the capture era when Goldsberry drove 6 transient marine mammal-eating whales into Bud Inlet, Olympia, right under the nose of the former Secretary of State. Again, using seal bombs and buzzing aircraft and generally hunting the whales down. And Ralph Munro, the former Secretary of State, was absolutely horrified by what he saw. He was out sailing with his wife, Carolyn, and they managed to get hold of the press. And on Monday, when the governor was still out of state, Ralph contacted the governor and was told to go to the governor's office where he would find 5 lawyers waiting for him. Within the next 2 weeks, lawsuits came and went, but the upshot was that the SeaWorld was banned from capturing whales in Washington state. There were only 2 whales left at the end of this time, and they were outside the legal limit, size-wise, and they were taken up to San Juan Island, where they had radio transmitters put on them, and they were released from Kanaka Bay, which is a potential place where, when she comes home, Lolita may go. So that was the end of the capture era, which decimated so many of our whales. And when the southern residents were listed as endangered in November 2005, National Marine Fisheries Service did give, as part of the reason, the upset to the population due to the capture era. So thank you very much for listening.